Greetings, Kindred. I am Voivode Maquette, and welcome back to our World of Darkness and another episode of Metaplot Monday. And this is going to be our second TLDR. I like this format. I like sitting here with the YouTube channel behind me and stuff like that, because I don't know, it feels more like a talk, you know? And you guys, as a community, are just, you're fun. And this isn't really something that anybody really asked. It's more of a continuation of a conversation that I had with one of my players, Daviga. And also, I think it was last Metaplot Monday, I actually had said, you know, let's talk about blood, you know? And that's what I want to do. I want to talk about blood and all of its properties, because we play a game dedicated to consumption of blood and what it does. But I've noticed that in a lot of the systems, it kind of takes backseat. And I know I've said this before in other videos, but when you don't focus on feeding, it kind of feels like you're just playing superheroes, and you have a power source that gets worn down, and eventually you just have to refill, offset, off topic. I know, like in older games that I've played in, if you have like herd or something like that, you can just set out like 5 to 15 minutes out of game, and just that means that you're visiting your herd, so you get to ignore the feeding aspect of Vampire. But when it comes to 5th edition, I find that it's more blatantly in your face, and that's something that I've come to really appreciate about this setting. What I mean by that is they've taken a system that we've had since the beginning for over 30 years at this point, which is the blood pool in Vampire. They had it in Vampire the Masquerade, they had it in Requiem, and they changed it to something else completely. They changed it from how much blood you have in your system to how satiated you are. They changed it from blood to hunger. And I really love the hunger system of 5th edition. I think that if I ever went back to playing with like the old Laws of the Night LARP system or something like that, I would probably find a way to work the hunger system in and the rouse check system in, simply because it makes it more Vampire. If you're playing Masquerade and you choose to just fade over the feeding, which, I mean, it's by all means within your right to do that, I just don't feel like you're playing Vampire at that point, in my opinion. And I don't know, it does seem like something that gets pushed off to the side. But with hunger, it's always there, because it's not about how much blood you drink. It's not about what you feed from, really. It's not like, oh, I can just sit back and drink this many rats, or I can bite this many people, or even I've got vampires in a cage that I feed off of. Because that one last trait of hunger never goes away. That's so unique to V5, and I love it, because you're always hungry, because it's not simply the amount of blood you have in your system. It's the carnage. It's the beast's need to take life. And that's truly what makes this game have a personal horror aspect to it. The fact that it's not just about how much you drink, that it's about what you do to get that drink, that last bit of hunger. And I don't know, maybe if characters got Golconda, they could ignore that portion of it. They don't get that limitation on hunger, because they have a balance with themselves and their beasts and stuff like that. But that would take it away so much. The hunger in this system is so profoundly Vampire, so much more than the blood pool system ever was. Now, the blood pool system was actually almost identical as far as Vampire Masquerade and Vampire Requiem. everybody had a blood pool of some fashion, and it was usually dictated by some other force to say how much blood you have. If you were playing a neonate 13th generation in most game systems of Vampire, you got 10 blood traits. And depending on what your generation was, you'd get more blood traits. But in V5, no matter what your generation, it's still 5 traits of hunger that you have access to. I guess access is really kind of a nice way of putting that you're cursed with it. But the higher your blood potency, the more chance you have to actually satiate yourself easier. As in, when you have a higher blood trait, you have the ability to roll more than one die when it comes to rouse checks. So you always have that fallback, that safety, that perhaps your blood is potent enough to keep you satiated longer and more efficiently. Unlike Vampire the Masquerade, where if you were running around as I misspoke. Unlike Vampire the Masquerade in the earlier systems, where you just had more blood you could hold, which didn't really make sense to me as a player, or as a storyteller, truthfully, because there's only so much room in your body. I think what it was supposed to mean was your body processed blood differently. Where if you were a lower generation, you were actually spending less of your blood. And that's how the equivalent was. It made feeding strange, but it also was showing the condensing. The fact that you drink and it would just concentrate within your system. Now, I've mentioned Requiem a couple of times, and the reason why I'm bringing up Requiem so much is because that's the system where we got blood potency from. For those of you who have not played Vampire the Requiem, it is a system of vampire that does not fall on the Judeo-Christian Cain mythos. It just steps well outside of that. And it goes more into vampires not knowing exactly where they came from. Because, and this is one of my favorite things, and it's a topic we'll actually come back to in a little bit, but the way that it works in Requiem, if you went into torpor, you stayed in torpor judging by both your blood potency and also your humanity. So if you have like a humanity of 10 and a blood potency of 1, you would go into torpor for 1 day. That's it. And it just goes, if you have a blood potency of 1, it's basically 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 1 year. Like, it steps down like that. But the higher your blood potency, the more likely you are going to stay into torpor longer. Because as you're in torpor, your blood potency actually drops. Which was a very interesting thing, because it stopped your character from getting too scary. In Vampire the Requiem and in Vampire the Masquerade, we now have this blood potency system that when you're a young neonate with a low blood potency, you can feed off pretty much anything. You can feed off animals that you find in the streets, you can go hunting, you can feed off people. You could feed off vampires if you're gonna play that risky route. But in Requiem and in Masquerade now, when you exist for long periods of time, your blood potency rises. Your blood becomes distilled. Now, in Vampire the Masquerade, it has a lot to do on decades. You've been active for decades, maybe a century, and your blood potency will rise. But in Requiem, your torpor would cause your blood potency to drop. And I just want you guys to think about that. The fact that these vampires, when they're in torpor, became weaker. They would lose access to their powers. Now, also in Requiem, the thing that made it so much different from Masquerade was that they suffered from horrific fever dreams the whole time they were in torpor. And when they woke up, they could not remember what was real and what was not. That meant that even their memories could not be trusted about past events, and no one knew exactly where vampires came from due to that reasoning. Now, I'm going off of a first edition Requiem when I say that. I don't really know much about second edition Requiem because I only played it in the LARP version, first edition. But it was such an interesting system because it stepped outside of the norm. It was still effectively Masquerade, but it was so centralized on a city-by-city basis that the idea that vampires might leave their cities to go to a different one was absurd. Completely absurd. Because there's wilderness in between those cities, and those cities are safety from werewolves and things like that. One of the big reasons I'm bringing this up right now is because in the book Beckett's Jihad Journal, there is a plot line. And I think this pops up in several other places in Masquerade. But there is a plot line that hints on the fact that there's a good chance that this loss of blood potency might actually exist in Masquerade. And that even the ancients, when they wake up from their millennia-long torpor, they're going to wake up weaker than they were. And that's why there's no world-changing event when these monster godlike vampires wake up. Now, the reason why this comes to mind is because Daviga and I got into an interesting conversation about how, what if that thinning of the blood, because loss of potency is literally thinning of the blood, what if that's what causes the ability for vampires to mutate, to change? Now, if you hear me out on this one, if Gehenna is a cyclical event, like Beckett says, and blood potency is also a cyclical event, much like it is in Requiem, and has been hinted at in Masquerade, what if when the Antediluvians, or the beings such as the Antediluvians, this theory actually makes it so that Antediluvians might not truly exist, at least in the form that we know of them. But what if when they hit down to 0 blood potency, that's when we start finding mutations in the vitae, mutations in the blood, such as we are seeing now with thin blood alchemy? What if aberrations such as Serpentis and Vicissitude and other things such as that, strange powers that aren't necessarily seen in the Book of Nod that Cain had, what if those are taken because the Antediluvians, quote unquote, hit a low level and were able to mutate for survival purposes? That sounds very weird. I completely understand, but it is happening again right now with thin blood alchemy. These vampires are thin bloods, and they are at blood potency of 0, and they are creating new disciplines. And the idea that blood potency can become more potent, that blood potency can become less potent, is at its root what blood alchemy, what thin blood alchemy actually is, because you're literally distilling the blood within you to do other things. Now, in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition, in the companion, we have this wonderful, it's my Requiem book, we have this wonderful blood chart on page 63 of the companion that tells us what 5th edition allows, how it works. And that is, if you are of blood potency of 0, you're a thin blood. At 13th gen, you're a 1. And it goes all the way down to 10 blood potency. But at that point, you get to add 6 dice to your blood surge. That's insane. At 10, you add 5 points of superficial damage of healing. You can heal 5 superficial damage in a single roll. That's insane. That's crazy. Discipline power bonus. You get 5 dice to add to your discipline uses. Discipline rouse check reroll. Level 5 and below. So all the disciplines available at that point. Your Bane severity is at a 6. You're monstrous at this point. And then your feeding penalty, which I think is probably one of the most important parts of this, is animal and bagged blood slake no hunger. Slake 3 less hunger per human. So if you're draining a human, you have to drink 3 times as much. And then you must drain and kill a human to reduce your hunger below 3. Eventually, that is the kind of thing that is going to cause your vampire to enter torpor. In which case, I would say that, depending on your humanity, there might be some possible way to calculate your blood potency actually dropping. Now, the reason I'm getting into this is because when Daviga and I were having the conversation, a possible new house rule in the Thicker Than Water Chronicles came up. And that is, whenever your blood potency changes in game, you might end up being able to spend XP to change the disciplines you have. Like 1 discipline. So that would make it so that your character would be able to reassign a discipline level, depending on what they're doing. And again, this is just house rule, possible house rule in my game, depending on what the other players think of it. But blood is very interesting, and it's highly ignored that I've seen. And obviously, I have not been all around the world. I have not been to all of your tables or all of your LARP areas. I have not played in all of your games. But I have noticed in the games that I have played in, and I have played in, my opinion, I've played in a good significant amount of games, that the feeding aspect of Vampire just seems to be left to the wayside. The reason why the conversation came up between myself and Daviga is because in our last game session, they spent a good amount of their time trying to feed. And it wasn't even something that I knew what they were doing. They themselves put themselves through their own feeding scene because their blood had gotten low. Their hunger had gotten high, I should say. What they ended up doing was actually brilliant in my acceptance of this. Was they went into a restaurant, they got some food, they took food and put it into a cardboard box. They put cardboard box with a hole in it into an alleyway, and then sat back and used animalism to call rats to come and eat the food. At which point, the rats went in the box with a successful coaxing, using the animalism discipline, and they had a box full of food. And they used them to feed from at that point in time. I barely did anything with this. This player took it upon themselves to do a feeding scene that the storyteller did not know he was running. That's awesome. That's really, really cool. Because most of the time, feeding scenes tend to be initiated by the storyteller. I'm very lucky where a lot of my players don't tend to skip out on things when it comes like that. Daviga goes out of his way to make sure he gets a vampiric experience in Vampire the Masquerade. With the way that Serendipity plays, her characters tend to fall into feeding scenes when they need it. I have a few violent characters that don't shy away from the feedings either. And it does become important in the game. These characters will actually go, we are in the middle of something, but this is important. They will step to the side and handle their own feeding. I haven't had any characters who feed together. I have not had any joint feeding efforts. Not really. They take it as a very personal, private event in their lives, but it is not something that goes ignored. We do use things such as herd, but those tend to be used in downtime, so they don't have to waste their downtime actions on anything else, where they use their feeding and their herd to continue about things so that they can continue to have access to the actions that they do on downtimes. But in game, there's a hunt. I can actively say that the last 2 game sessions, Daviga has fed themselves without me having to initiate any type of challenge. That's so refreshing as a storyteller to see the players go, I am playing a vampire. I am not playing a superhero. With Blood, you get this awesome new mechanic also called Predator Types, which I plan on doing an entire series dedicated to Predator Types, digging into them and really looking at them. And there are the ones from the core book, but there are others that have really taken a life of their own that you can find in other books. And it's so good. It's such a great mechanic, and I'm so glad we have them. I really wish that was kind of a thing before. They have made it in with the Predator Types that you don't get your standard 3 disciplines as you would in character for, like, Toreador getting Auspex, Celerity, and Presence. Well, what if your Toreador is a Sandman? There's a good chance that they could get Obfuscate instead of one of their standard clan disciplines. Because that character has adjusted to feeding in a specific way, has adapted, I should say, to feeding in a specific way. It's almost like the Ventrue feeding Bane, I guess, that they have to feed on specific things. But they don't have to. This does not dictate what your character has to do. It's not, well, you are an alley cat, therefore you're an attack feeder, and you're stuck doing that forever. It's not like that. But you did do that enough times that you now have celerity or potence that you fed from, that adrenaline-fueled feeding style so many times that even if you were a Ventrue, you popped out with potence or celerity. And your abilities and your merits and flaws have been judged by it. That you've done stuff to warrant an enemy or something like that because of the way that you feed. You've gotten yourself into trouble. That's awesome. And I've noticed a lot of SPCs in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition don't come with Predator Types, which makes so much sense on a storytelling standpoint. Like, so much sense. Because your SPCs are not going to be going through feeding scenes most of the time. But for personality building, they really do. I'm going to bring James Merrick in as an example here. James Merrick is my old prince from Thicker Than Water. He was also moonlighting as the local baron. But his Ventrue feeding issue is whiskey. He needs to feed off people who drink. Due to the fact that he was embraced in the mid-1880s in a small bar-filled town and was a bit of a drunk before he was embraced, due to personal issues, he was a highly depressed human. He became an assault feeder. So he's a venture that has potence. That's scary. He's got fortitude and potence. No one really expected it, but it helped me build the SPC out more fully. I know my characters. I almost every single one of my SPCs that I have for Portland, not Chicago, because we're running through the Chicago Chronicles right now, but almost all of the SPCs that I have for Portland, I know them as if I had been playing them for years, because I have. I know these individual characters. I've put so much work into them. And I can tell you, even after only playing 5th edition for a couple of years since it's come out, I can tell you what most of their feeding, their predator type is. Because I've used their predator types to describe how the characters are. I've used those predator types to help flesh out their backgrounds. And it shows who they feed from. Which makes feeding from the same people that they feed from highly dangerous. Because they are going to protect their herd. They are going to protect their feedstock. And I think that's really where difficulty level in feeding areas comes from, when it comes to like figuring out how easy it is to get food in this place or that place, or off of this part of society, whether you're feeding from the police or you're feeding from hospital workers or people who go to self-help meetings or something like that. There's always going to be something else that's feeding off of them. And the blood is so important because it's vampire. We're playing a vampire game. Blood is central. And out of all the years that I've played Vampire the Masquerade, and I will completely tell you right now that I started Vampire the Masquerade in 2003. In 2003, I started playing Vampire. And feeding never took this much of central stage in both my storytelling and my playing. Now, a lot of that is because when I started playing in Vampire the Masquerade, there was a massive number in this LARP. And there wasn't really much time to focus on each individual person's feeding scenes. It was, how are you feeding? What are you doing? Let's move on. When I could make an entire night into just trying to feed in 5th edition. Because sometimes it's hard. Because sometimes you need to have more of a challenge than just, oh, I'm dominating this person. Or I'm using presence to bring them into a back alley. We'll play it out. We'll actually try to see how this person hunts. And I've found that some people are just uncomfortable. They don't know how to do it. And that's, I think, one of the fun things to actually stick on is the fact that they don't know. They don't know how to do it. And they learn in character. They actually learn how to feed in character. Daviga's character, Annette, is just now learning how they like to feed. And we've actually thought about, we've discussed it, writing up a whole new predator type specifically for them. And as we were discussing it, you would get the same discipline benefits as a farmer, either animalism or protean, because it has to deal with feeding off animals. But instead of breeding them, you would trap them. So the abilities would be different. The advantages could be different. But the disciplines would be the same. Maybe it would be a specialized version of farmer called a trapper. That's something that we're kicking around. And, you know, when we figure it out, we'll probably make a vampire bite out of it. It's been a while since we've had one of those anyway. But when you really start to get into it, feeding can take up an entire game session. Now, we're in the middle of doing an arc, which is my style of running the game. Is I will run them through a 2 or 3 month worth of sessions, where each individual session is one night after the other. So they don't really have a chance to use downtime actions. If session 1 is on a Friday, then session 2 would be taking place on that Saturday, even though it's a week separate. So the characters have to feed in character while the game is actually in progress. Every once in a while we will do just real-time games where we play once and we'll go, okay, we'll meet up next week. And then they get to send me their downtimes and they can talk about feeding and that if they wish. But for the most part, when we do these story arcs, they get cornered, they get trapped, and they have to feed themselves. And I find that so helpful. What do you guys think about the hunger, the blood, the potency, like everything that we've talked about here? What is your take on it? Do you feel that being forced to kill to get rid of that last hunger makes the game richer? Because personally, I do. I don't care for the implied heightened amount of violence that this game has to have due to that. But what I care about is the fact that the vampire now has real horror. Because they're trying to hold on to their humanity as much as possible. Even vampires who are on paths. In the system that was given to us in the Sabbat Player's Book, which is not canon, they still have to take care of their humanity even if they're on a path of enlightenment. They might have a very skewed version of humanity that they play with, but it's still going up against what standard humanity is in the core book. So they still have to worry about not taking that many stains. Where they might not take a loss of humanity for doing something despicable such as diablerie, they will take stains for it. Now, diablerie is another thing. When you diablerize, your blood potency can change. Depending on, it goes up to the level, or at least it can go up to the level of the individual vampire that you're feeding from. And the diablerie rules in V5 are just disgusting. Like, seriously, take the time and actually sit down and read the diablerie rules. And if you have the older systems, compare the two. Because you get so many more benefits in V5 than anything else that I've ever seen. I'll take that back. You have the option. You have the possibility of getting so much more disgusting powers in this system than you ever did before. And it's one of those things where, like, there is really such a benefit to diablerie. But you have to weigh that, should I do it? Should I not do it? And I don't think a lot of people really take into consideration how damning it is to commit that act of cannibalism. And I don't care what the Camarilla rules are, or what the Sabbat viewpoints are, or what the Anarchs think about it. I'm actually talking about just the whole concept of you're not just drinking the blood of this person, but you're damning their soul for all eternity by trapping them in you. Like, if you're having a weak moment and you've diablerized at some point in the past, that person that you've taken into yourself very well might take over. They are another voice on top of the beast in your ear. It's kind of terrifying. It really is, because even if you pass all the tests, you could still be slightly losing yourself. Your humanity is being judged by it, definitely. But what does that mean to most players when they play the game? I had a very interesting interaction with a pander actually, one time, years back, before 5th edition. Again, we were playing the second edition revised, and I was playing a Camarilla loyal Toreador, and they were playing this really scary Pander, and we got into a discussion about souls. Now, this person was not being nice to me. I did not have a Sabbat friend or anything like that. I just happened to be able to perk his interest before he tried to kill me. And that character had to take on the whole concept of souls. That we weren't just damned creatures right off the bat. And when he started thinking about that, it was just such an interesting conversation. Because it was like he had just decided that we're vampires, we're damned. We're vampires, it doesn't matter what we do. Because we're already going to hell. So you just go out there and raise as much havoc as you want to. Try to live as long as you can to postpone the inevitable. But like the idea of souls, that vampires still had souls, was just so much for him. Because we had gotten into a conversation about infernalism, because unfortunately, my sire, this is the first character that I ever played, mind you. My sire, who was another player character, had gone infernal. And it was awful, because he had 2 children. It was me and my character's sister. We were playing twins. And him going infernal damned us all. Just damned all of us. Damned our whole clan. Because we were just looked at as the children of the infernal at that point. And when I was actually able to get out my thoughts about how my sire had sold his soul to become infernal, that pander stopped and went, "We have souls. Are you saying we have souls?" Like it was a whole thing, and it really broke him. But the idea of what you do to keep your humanity intact is completely wound up in your feeding. Because look at all the different predator types out there. You've got people who feed on social cliques. You've got people who feed on cults that cultivate their own cults. You've got farmers who only feed off animals. You've got the roadside. The roadside killer is probably one of my favorite predator types, because of the whole concept of you feed off the transient population because no one's going to miss them in the area that you're in. I really like that. The first gangrel I ever built for 5th edition that was a player character for me for a little bit was a roadside killer before I even really knew what a roadside killer was. I took Alley Cat because my character slept in like the areas between the cities, and if I saw somebody with a flat tire or something like that, I'd jump and I'd attack them. That's a roadside killer, but that didn't exist when I built the character, so I went with Alley Cat. But I really do want you guys to think about feeding. I want you guys to actually stop and think about how important it is to your games. Do you feel that it's important enough? Do you feel that it should be backed down on a little bit? Because I think everybody's got their own opinions on this one, and I'd love to hear them. But that's really all I had for today. I just really wanted to talk about feeding, and you guys are my go-to when it comes to talking about these kind of things that are on my mind. So, I am Voivode Maquette. This is Our World of Darkness, and this has been Metaplot Monday and TLDR. I will see you guys in the next one. Good evening.